The 5 other shapes that are actually at this level of development are all echoes of the ones that we've already looked at. I want to just pull them out quickly. These are marvellous. We're going to just whip through these quickly because it doesn't matter too much. There we go. So they're all in a nice little line. We've got 5 here and 7 there, which are the next layer up. We're growing. Geometry is going to, all of these shapes grow out of the ones that we've already looked at, which we already know are reflections of each other. We're happy that this is very, very simple stuff that's really happily becoming really complex all on its own. The way these work is this one is called an icosahedron. Thank you, tetrahedron. And this one is typically called a truncated tetrahedron. This is the feminine form of the masculine, and we're all used to this rumour of chopping a bit off the bloke to get a girl. This is effectively the same thing. And none of these geometries, whereas you'll all have seen these, you will hardly have seen any of these other 13 shapes in recent years. Now there are books coming out with all of these feminine forms in them, but they more or less disappeared with a couple of exceptions that remind me to remind you about. So what's happened is it looks like somebody's chopped the corners off this and given us one that's made up of triangles and hexagons, okay? So this one divides everything into triangles and hexagons, pentagons and triangles, squares and triangles. So what they're doing now is they're building shapes in the mixtures of all the shapes they've already used, okay? The most important thing about this though, and this is something when I was taught this, I teach it now unthinkingly, but this is news to people like architects and physicists and stuff, that you don't have to chop the corners off the boy to get the girl. You have to do a bit of imaginary work here because I broke the model that shows how this works. Okay, but you can see that as I point this point at you, there's 3 ribs meeting there, okay? So if we imagine those 3 ribs moving apart from each other, which is the first method of growth, until they're as far apart as they are long, okay? And if you connect the ends of them, you'll have a triangle, won't you? Everybody happy with that? The ribs move apart, 3 points, because there's 3 ribs, join them together, there'll be a triangle. Just like that, okay? And because this is the same on all corners, so will this be. That's a really important thing, because what we're starting to recognise there is the redevelopment of the woman as a progenitor of growth and expansion, rather than as a sidekick for whatever it is that we've been doing. And this is echoing through our entire society now, because the feminine way of doing things is not writing and logic, it's looking at images. So once we started getting cinema and TV and stuff, we started reanimating the goddess within us. So the content might be rubbish, but the buttons it's pressing are really important. And what we're doing by looking at these geometries now is we're seeing feminine geometries for the first time and putting them back on the morphogenetic field. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail, but every single one of these has a truncated form in terms of classical geometry. Every single one of them can be grown using the same principles, okay? So these 4 ribs move apart, they'll give you a square at the end, which is the shape that you've got on your truncated octahedron, okay? All happy with that, because I don't like to labour the point. As it happens, there are 2 feminine pieces of geometry that have remained in our purview. One of them is the vesica piscis in its 3D form, which looks like a rugby ball, okay, which we kick around on a Sunday afternoon. The other one is this one. This is what's called typically the truncated icosahedron. And if I show it you in a different colour so that you can see the pentagons and the hexagons that make it up, you'll notice that it's the shape of a football. So the other one we kick around on a muddy field on a Saturday afternoon. And I do find myself wondering whether this is an accident. One of the reasons, some schools of thought have the masculine and feminine all turned around. One of the things I do, which we're not going to have time to do today, but if people ever see the talk again, is we use kinesiology, we use muscle testing. Everybody, a lot of people familiar with that? It's a way of dowsing your own energy system, and every single one of these forms has got circuits, electronic circuits in the human body, which test weak when you look away and strong when you look at them. Now the feminine shapes, when we do this muscle testing, what they do is they help counterbalance electrical interference. So if you put somebody's hand over a live socket, they will test weak because there's electrical interference with them. If you show them any of these feminine forms, they will test strong. Yes, and the same as if you wear jewellery or if you have tattoos or all of that. Mobile phones, you instantly test weak. If you look at the masculine geometry, it's electric and it balances the magnetic interference of the phones. That's why I call these shapes feminine and these shapes masculine, because they manifest a different effect in the human matrix. Okay? So all of those shapes can be grown from their predecessors by the ribs moving apart. Nice, simple growth, okay? And once again, if the ribs were all the same length as the original models, we'd once again have bigger shapes. Now, only some of these shapes actually grow any further, because the next lot of shapes grow out of these. It's just like real life. We have 1, 2, we have 4 on this next level. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. This time, the growth is somewhat different. And I haven't got any models to show how this layer of growth works. You'll just have to take my word for it. I have got models for the next layer of growth, though, the last one. There's only 2 of these elements, earth and ether, that actually grow up to become the next level. And the way they do it is this time, instead of the ribs moving apart, I still can't do this, and I've been trying this for years. I can sort of see it's right, but you start with your truncated cube, okay, which we've grown. We know we've grown from a cube now. And you imagine that its 8-sided pieces and its 3-sided pieces float apart until they're as far apart as they are long. So it's the faces, not the ribs this time. And then when you join them up the easiest way, you get the next shape in the sequence, which is this one, which is called a snub cube. And this one we can see is made up of octahedrons with triangles round it. This one's gone for squares with triangles round it. This one goes the same way. The sign for ether is also the only single element. It's rather interestingly, none of the masculine elements actually grow. In shamanic terms, it's only the feminine elements that grow into this into this next level. If you let the faces of this one move apart, so the triangles and the pentagons move apart, and then you join them in the quickest way possible, you get this. This is the first shape that has 3 different shapes in it, because it's made up of pentagons, squares and triangles. So now Spirit's getting really flash, and this, if all the edges were the same size, would be really, really big. You'd be able to fit your head into it if you started with a side only this big. So things are growing really, really fast. And it's very spherical. Can you see? This one, the same thing would apply to it though. If you put a sphere around it, only the points would touch the sphere and the edges just wouldn't. And it's our other mixture. This one also grows to another level. So if we imagine the faces moving apart, we end up with one of these. There is, you will be glad to hear, just one more level of those before we get to see some really crazy things that relate these. The marriage of earth and air and the marriage of ether and water are the only 2 that grow to the fully crystallised state. These are quite tremendous chemical compositions can be found in these. When you look at pictures of crystallography and stuff like that, you can see bonding patterns that look like this. This one's made up of hexagons, octagons and squares, and this one's made up of hexagons, decagons and squares. Hexagons, pentagons and squares. And they're the biggest shapes that we get to go. Now I've actually got those 2. So that we can see the one growing from the other. And this is an important growth. In the middle of this shape is one of these, which is made of squares and triangles, which hopefully you can all see. And wrapped round the outside of it is one of these. So you can actually see, if I point you at the square in the middle of that face, okay, everybody see the square in there. This rib moves out to here, that one moves out to here, that one to there, and that one to there, and then you join them all up. So the 4-sided shape becomes an 8-sided shape. And now that we're getting to this sort of level, you'll start finding that these shapes actually plug into each other. So this has got a kind of receiver on it, which is made of squares and triangles into which that would plug. That's kind of the secret to your immune functions and stuff like that. And actually ultimately to chemical bonding and all that sort of stuff, ultimately geometric. So if this was made to the right size, you can plug that into it, this into it, and one of these as well, which is really great. I'll hand that one round. So that's to show how one genuinely does grow into another. This is really, it seems really ordinary to me, this data now, but it's absolutely stunning. This really isn't published. I think the wooden books maybe have published something like this, but it would have all been kept, it was all a secret kept really under wraps for ages and ages, you know, and now we can do it all in an afternoon. These amazing shapes that are just recalling these ancient things that you've got within you.